Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the fifth and final session of this year's TRT World Forum. I'm Ali Janayanash, a correspondent and presenter for TRT World News. I have the distinguished pleasure of being your moderator for this next session. I hope you've been enjoying the forum so far, and I'm also sure that you would agree that we've had some really interesting discussions. Now, we'll be taking the discussion a little bit further with this next session called The Future of Work and Education, Preparing for a Post-Pandemic World. Here's a look at that. All right, without a doubt, the COVID-19 pandemic has been labeled as the defining global health challenge of our times. But in reality, it is so much more than that. It's also an unprecedented social and economic crisis, the likes of which the world has not witnessed since the Second World War. Yes, efforts are being made to ensure economic stability and the continuation of productivity as the world continues to struggle to contain this deadly disease. Now, as part of this process, and as many of you out there are watching can attest to, both our work and education models have undergone some very significant changes. I mean, from my part, I've literally set up a small studio in my apartment where I've been presenting news bulletins from home for the better part of the last 9 months. So I've transitioned from the chaotic environment of a television newsroom to a small living room filled with couch pillows. And it's not just work, education as well. Tens of millions of students around the world are being educated remotely. Things that may not have been considered, or things that may have been considered impossible before the pandemic. Over the next 90 minutes, we're going to be analyzing whether or not the current conditions around work or remote work and education are necessary and appropriate for this ongoing crisis. We're also going to be discussing the issue of equality when it comes to education opportunities and how these changes might impact the future of how we work and how we learn. All right, to discuss this and more, it is now my pleasure to introduce our panel of esteemed speakers. Professor Yin-Cheng Cheng is an Emeritus Professor of Education and Senior Research Fellow of the Education University of Hong Kong. He serves as president to several global and regional educational associations. His research areas include educational reforms, paradigm shifts, and school management. Emiliana Vegas is a senior fellow and co-director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute. Emiliana's expertise cover education in developing countries. She's written extensively on issues affecting educational systems in Latin America as well as the Caribbean. Selçuk Şirin is a professor of applied psychology at NYU. Dr. Şirin's work focuses on the development of educational and psychological resources for marginalized youth. He has conducted studies with vulnerable children across the US, Europe, and Turkey. And Kathleen Delaski is a social entrepreneur. She has launched or co-launched 4 nonprofit organizations in the past 2 decades, all related to improving the quality of education for non-elite students. With one of these, the Lab, she saw the need for a nonprofit to help learning institutions and other players design the future of education. All right, welcome to you all. Kathleen, I'd like to begin with you. We are, I guess it's the camera. We're supposed to. Okay, there we go. When we talk about this pandemic, we often refer to it as the biggest challenge of our lifetime, possibly the biggest since World War II. I can see the cliche in that, but I also understand that the last 70 years has been a period of unprecedented advancements as well as opportunities. Among these, obviously, improved access to education all across the board, Yes, we know of the disruptions that COVID-19 has caused, but from an educational standpoint, talk to us how deep and how strong this offsetting has been.
Well, if you want to talk about there have obviously been a couple of silver linings that are very important in terms of advancing innovation and speeding up innovation. But obviously, you can't get past the negatives that it will probably take us years to analyze. People are talking about the generation that may be lost, that in terms of the very critical development moments that they're missing. That where I live in the Washington D.C. area, the students have not yet been to school physically, except for very few. School has never been opened up, and it's looking like it won't be for a year and at least 3 months, total by the time this is over. And the impact of that, when we hear about the students who are being lost in the system, when learning is happening online, it's devastating. There have been some bright spots, obviously. And I work more in the school to work space, so looking at career training and reinventing college. I run the Education Design Lab, which is focused on how to make learning more flexible, more affordable, more visible, and more relevant. And in this sphere, actually, COVID has helped us in some ways to target the innovation. Necessity has become the mother of invention. And we have been able to work with many colleges and many training programs that are bringing their programs online, and actually makes them more accessible to people who before COVID could not participate. Also, the cost of universities and colleges are being challenged in a way that is forcing institutions to come up with cheaper ways to offer their services. And these are a few of the silver linings, but I don't, while I think a lot of us have seen a speeding up of the interest in the impact of the work that we're having, we really have to start the conversation with, what is happening to children around the world who cannot go to school and have those needs met.
Kathleen, I do see the silver lining, and we're going to talk about sort of the reinvention and the future of education as we sort of transition into this post-pandemic world. But in terms of assessing the situation, Professor, I want to turn to you. As an international education researcher, when you look at what we've been going through, do you think that the coronavirus pandemic has the potential to undo the successes of the past? Professor Ying Cheng Chung?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
As you okay.
Go ahead. I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on the fact that, if this, I know there's a bit of a delay, so let me just ask my question, then I'll wait for your answer in terms of this coronavirus pandemic undoing the successes of the past.
The impact of pandemic on education are very complex and huge, covering all key aspects and all levels, from individuals, institution to the system level, and also the whole world. The Joint Research Center of the European Commission has recently released a report on the impact of pandemic. I do not repeat the report here, but according to my observations, I would like to point out that the pattern of impact, that can be classified into different type of disruption, including 6 types, such as the technological disruption in the technology, in the technical aspect, economic disruption related to the resources, the economy. And also you can see that social disruption a big change among people. And also the political disruption, you can see that, cultural disruption, and all these disruptions come together, contributing to the formation of learning disruption. You see that, affecting our school, our education, and also our young people's future. For example, the digital divide or gaps, are typical technological disruption in online learning, and also in how to ensure quality, equity for those disadvantaged students. Other example, lack of appropriate resources to support innovation and change in learning, teaching, and school operation. The school have been closed and no education can happen. All these resources issue related to the economic disruption, on education. I think really no exception. All country, all area are suffering from this disruption. But at the same time, this challenge from disruption may be used as crucial driving force to the future of work and education. In particular, this challenge will meet together with other driving forces like globalization, technology breakthrough, international competition, and strong demand for development. That all these driving forces come together with the pandemic destruction, driving the future transformation. The classification of multiple disruptions, I think, can provide a comprehensive perspective to look at the impact of pandemic, and also how to manage, how to deal with it. To different countries, the concern about destruction may be different. Some countries are more concerned with the technological destruction. The whole city, unable to operate due to the impact of the pandemic. Some countries are more concerned with economic destruction, seriously, and also some are more concerned with the social and political destruction. From research or policy point of view, what impact, what implication? To address the issue of these multiple disruption and other coming challenge, I think the research agenda or the policy agenda may focus not only on the constraint due to the impact of pandemic, but also take the opportunity to change the traditional education into a new one. This is a golden opportunity to make our education change, to a new one that can meet the new future in a post-pandemic world. In particular, we need to change education with innovation. You see that. But what is the most needed innovation in education against disruption or pandemic? What most needed innovation? According to my observations, we need innovation, particularly in 4 areas, 4 aspects of education. The first one, we need to develop a new set of student quality and capacity for the future, because the future has been changed a lot, not following the traditional line or the traditional way to happen. A completely uncertain, First, we need to develop, in particular, we need to develop students contextualized multiple intelligence and creativity as cutting edge. They have the cutting edge for them to deal with the multiple
Professor,
uncertainty.
If I could sort of interrupt you for just a bit, because I want to bring in Emiliana. Emiliana, you heard the professor sort of talking about the different disruptions and how different regions are dealing with it. You know as well as anyone the impact this has had on developing regions. Latin America is your specialty, so perhaps you could actually start off by giving us specific examples of that. I mean, I'm especially curious to find out how a disruption in a classical model educational system differs in developing countries when you sort of compare it to Europe. I mean, are regional or developing countries more vulnerable here?
Thank you so much for having me. And let me start by saying, even before COVID hit, in developing countries, and particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, education systems had managed to expand access a lot. And so there were, almost pretty much universal access to primary education. And a great majority of those who finished primary school were going on to secondary school. But the problems we were observing was that they were not learning the skills they needed even before COVID. So prior to COVID, let's say in the latest program in international student assessment run by the OECD, the countries from the region that participated, their students, less than a quarter of them, less than 25% of them, mastered the basic skills in reading, and even a lower share in math by the time they were 15 years old. And those are the students who are in school. Moreover, there were really large differences between students who come from wealthy backgrounds and students who come from the poorest backgrounds. So we would say that, prior to COVID, learning was low, it was unequal, and it was very inadequate for, the 21st century industrial technical world in which we live, where the digitalization is everywhere. Now COVID hit and sent all students home for months, as Kathleen was saying, in Washington, D.C., where I also live, but all over Latin America and the Caribbean, with the exception of Nicaragua. Really, every country closed schools, and only Uruguay has been able to reopen fully since June. And so we have, all basically students out of school. Some countries now making the efforts to gradually reopen in staggered ways because they realize that that even though there's a lot of innovation taking place and a lot of really creativity, from teachers and parents and very well-intentioned administrators, the reality is that there's not the infrastructure in place, and a lot of inequality in access to, for example, connectivity, internet, quality materials online. And so that's, and we know also that there's more than learning that takes place in schools. And particularly in developing countries, schools also provide, in many cases, the only safe place for students, the only place where they get a full meal per day, and where they also have access to health services. So the impact that it's having in developing countries is huge, not just in terms of learning, which is, of course, the main concern, but also in terms of other outcomes such as, health and well-being.
So some of the problems that we're seeing in that region sort of predate COVID, perhaps have its roots in early education. All right, I think it's a perfect segue to sort of bring in Professor Selçuk. Professor Şirin, good to have you here on the session. Now, an overwhelming majority of education covers children. You specialize in children and youth development. I'm wondering what your assessment is when it comes to the effect that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on this particular demographic.
Well, the one aspect, thank you for inviting me. It's a great session so far. One aspect of this is education, which has been mentioned. I think there we have to really look at the inequalities that was already there before COVID-19 and how it is kind of making every statistics that we have in terms of learning gaps even bigger, larger. In other words, children who are more vulnerable, either by status in their countries or socioeconomic background, are falling behind in terms of achievement indicators. But maybe we can talk more about that later. What is also interesting here is there is an opportunity for resetting the gaps between countries, because in a way COVID-19 presents a universal challenge, and I think every country is struggling. Like we just heard, in Washington, D.C., schools are closed the same way schools are closed everywhere else. Now, the problem here in the U.S. is not that different from the rest of the world, where we have a large number of students who have limited access to quality online education, and they are the ones who are going to be left behind after we are done with this crisis. So, can we do something innovative here is the question, and I think COVID-19, in a way, bring the reform that is much delayed to the education. Every country, every language, if you just type reform and education together, you will see that reform is most likely associated with the sector of education. But yet it's a very conservative area. We didn't really change much over the last 200 centuries. We still have the same school buildings, pretty much the same curriculum. The delivery is the same. The roles of teachers and principals are pretty much the same. So, everything changes, but schools are the same. And now with COVID-19, we are realizing that, you can learn from home. Not everything, but certain things can be learned out of school. So I think going forward, we really have to start thinking about the role of teachers, the role of school buildings, starting with architecture, curriculum. Why do we have class times? Why are we stacking up 40, 50 kids in a classroom and putting one adult in the room? It just doesn't add up. Everything we know about child development, I study early childhood. Over the last 20, 30 years, we learned so much about brain development. Everything starts at age 3. So why are we waiting until age 6, 7 to have students in schools? And we also know that, after I am a college professor, and this is going to sound odd, but I think the idea of teaching some of the basic skills at age 18 doesn't really make sense. When you think of brain development, it's kind of a little bit late unless you have an infrastructure. So I think there are a lot of questions from early child education to college education that we have delayed in responding and answering or thinking about. And now with COVID-19, we are here and we have to face all these issues all at once. And in that sense, I think it's an opportunity. I see a lot of good answers that are being debated in different countries, and I think it's good to have different approaches to this problem. Now, the one I think both in Turkey, in the US, and I just heard in Latin America as well, there's an immediate issue that we have to address, which is all these kids who are left behind, vulnerable kids. We're not even talking about refugees, we're not even talking about immigrants, but a lot of low-income kids in different countries are going to lose a year of learning. Now, if you lose a year of learning in elementary school, that's really multiplied if you get to college level. So a lot of these kids will not have the advantage of going to college. In other words, the effect of social class, socioeconomic status, has always been there in terms of achievable outcomes. COVID-19 made it worse. If you are living in a household with one college degree parent, with some books and some social capital, as we call it, you are okay. You are continuing to learn because you have an internet access, you have a computer, etc. That's, depending on which country you are, it's half the kids or a little bit more or a little less. But there is this other group who have none of that. In other words, if they are not going to school, they don't have quality interactions at home, they don't have adult supervision, they don't have even the number of vocabularies shared in the household from early childhood forward. So they are the ones that I think we are going to call in the near future as lost generation of COVID-19, unless we do something about it radically. And I don't see any radical change there. Now, if one more point I can make, that's the idea of COVID generation. Now, we talk about generation X, Y, Z, alpha, all those labels, but they are not really as useful as they are developed by market researchers, right? They're based on their consumptions, etc. What we are experiencing right now, what kids and adolescents, young people are experiencing right now, will transform their lives, will transform their idea of where they live, how they look at the world. So I think this COVID-19 generation will be not that different from 68 youth appraisals in France and the rest of the world, or not that different from the Great Generation, Great Depression, during the Depression era in the US. We are experiencing something global together. My hope is generation, which country they live, will have a more global understanding of challenges facing this earth. And I think they will be a little bit more open-minded about issues like global warming, issues like global inequality. That's my hope that will come out of the COVID-19 crisis.
I think we share that hope. All right. As with all of our panelists, I think many of you made a lot of good points, but I sort of want to narrow the discussion as we move forward. Kathleen, if I can turn to you. Professor Shidin talked about narrowing the gaps, the need to sort of bring innovation, whether it's reforming teachers or even the school buildings that date back 200 years. I mean, do you think that this coronavirus pandemic was sort of the disruptor, the disruption waiting to happen for the world of education?
Absolutely. We were talking about all these things before, but there was not that the forcing mechanism to make them happen. And obviously, I'm not an expert in the K-12 or the early childhood. We work more with starting at young adults, or sort of later in high school in this country, what we call high school, through workforce development and even lifelong reskilling, helping with the massive shift of skills development that needs to happen probably across the world. So yes, when we look at the question of does the school building need to change, we look at something we call the weave. Right, the idea of the weave is that that learning, at least when you get past a certain age of maybe 14, really needs to be thought about from how do you weave together the parts of your life as you are becoming an adult to learn from many environments. They say 95% of learning happens outside the classroom, and the skills that we're being asked to have in the future of work are much more about what we call human skills or soft skills, whether it's collaboration or empathy or resilience. That those skills need to be developed in contextual situations and assessed accordingly. So how do we teach that? You don't teach it in a desk with the 40 or 50 students that the professor was talking about. You probably learn that in life, in school, in family situations, in community service, and in work. And so we are designing programs around the country right now that are looking at how do you weave together school and work. We were doing this before the pandemic, and I will say that aspect of our work has slowed down during the pandemic as employers figure out how do we do internships and apprenticeships and give work experiences, and we're having to figure out how to do all of that virtually. But what comes out the other side of it, because we are getting so much better at virtual learning, is think about hybrid learning opportunities where you might, you work in teams as a group because that's critical going forward, but you might be moving in and out of situations physically and virtually, which will be much more comfortable for teachers, employers in the future than it has been in the past. The piece that we probably haven't been working on during COVID, because COVID it's showing us that we need to, but it hasn't demanded that we figure it out yet, is really how do you assess learning from the workforce point of view, because we're getting to what we're calling a skills-based learning and hiring environment, which requires us to know at the micro level, does this student or does this worker have this skill, and how do I know? And it's all going to be, in the future, it's all going to be digitally displayable and you'll be digitally visible. And so assessment really becomes the task that we need to figure out. But I would say to your question, what COVID has helped us do really is imagine, both from the employer's point of view, the teacher's point of view, and the learner's point of view, that we can mix all these things together.
Okay. Professor Yin, if I could turn to you. I mean, you've been listening to Kathleen. I mean, do you think that this will sort of ultimately prove to be beneficial, this in terms of the transition that we're going through or talking about?
I think related to two aspects I would like to address. The first one related to the school concept. I think after the using the technology, we changed the concept of school into a kind of learning ecosystem. It means that it is including technologies, platform, and also as well as human resources together, such that the learning is not in the classroom only, beyond classroom, as pointed out by other speakers. You see that. I think how we can use the environment, no matter technical aspect, technology aspect, or human aspect, come together to group our students contextualize the multiple intelligence, such that they can deal with the complex and multiple situation. You see that this is the we need to further develop the technology aspect. So now the other issue related to the digital divide. Because a different school and different ecosystem may have a different level of impact. To some schools, they have the equipment, they have the computing facilities, such that they can achieve higher level and have more opportunity for learning. To solve the problem of the equity, we need to ensure students have the opportunity to use this kind of learning ecosystem. Not limited by individual school, individual teacher. They have unbounded learning opportunity, open learning, benefit from all kinds of new development in the world. It means that they have not only the standard learning, they have the individualized learning, localized learning. Go to the community, and also the globalized learning. I think a more comprehensive concept. Not the traditional concept of school anymore. This is the preliminary response. Thank you.
Professor Ying, thank you very much. All right, I think it's time to bring in our fifth and final panelist. We do excuse our viewers for the slight delay, but I'd like to introduce Andreas Slasher. He is the Director for Education and Skills over at the OECD. He oversees the program for the international student assessment, as well as other efforts to improve global education practices. Andreas is, it's interesting, his efforts have had numerous praises from global leaders in terms of education policy. If Andreas is ready, let's bring him. Andreas, good to have you here on this panel. I'd like to begin by asking you, one of the programs that you initiated is that of the Program for International Student Assessment. I mean, do you think that the educational assessment can be used to account for the loss in terms of how much and where COVID-19 has set us back?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that's very important. I think we need to track very carefully the learning losses, particularly among the most marginalized students. I think learning losses have not affected all students in similar ways. Students who were very good at learning on their own, who had access to great technology, who had a very supportive ecosystem around them, teachers and parents included. For them, learning losses probably will be very contained. but many young people, who used to be spoon-fed by their teachers, who didn't have access to technology, who didn't have, parents pushing and supporting them, they were left very badly behind. And if we want to give them a second chance, we will need to be able to track their learning losses. And I do think that's a very important task for public policy.
All right, so no student behind, that's your philosophy. Professor Shirin, I want to come back to you for a second. I mean, what type of programs do you think specifically, not only programs, but also interventions do you think can sort of alleviate some of the difficulties that have sort of been accompanied with this COVID-19 crisis? Professor Shirin? Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Yes, I keep muting myself. I have a small cough this morning, but I just had my test at NYU. Everything is clear. It's just coffee. So to respond to your question.
Well, the good thing is that we're all in a virtual environment, so we're all safe. But
yes, I'm at home. I'm at home. So in each country, we know which groups are left behind. We know the vulnerable populations or student populations. So unless, like I said, unless we do something for those populations in particular, the gap will be there, right? Because while some kids continue to learn, it's like the summer learning gap, which we know a little bit from research. During summers, we know that low-income kids with limited resources to access educational resources are left behind. One idea would be to use the summertime for extra learning to get at lost learning capacity in different segments of populations. Another one is giving extra resources, including laptops, whatever online materials you have, not all populations, maybe some of the identified at-risk groups. But the idea has to be general. In Turkey, for example, as you know, the large number of students who are in villages and the rest of the country are also not attending schools in many ways they should be attending, because it's a small village anyway. Everyone sees each other. So we have to have local solutions in different countries, using both technology but also giving more room to make decisions at the local level. In addition to those, I think going forward, technology will be a big part of distance learning, online learning, however you call it, will be a big part. Go ahead.
All right, Professor Shirin, they're talking about sort of technology making a big difference. We're experiencing a slight gap in that technology. I think we may have temporarily lost him. I was just saying that your connection was poor. Do you want to sort of maybe wrap up your comments? We can. All right, let's just put you on hold for a second, and I want to bring in Emiliana. Let's see if we can sort of improve the connection that we have with you, Professor Shirin. I was looking at your previous experience with the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as the World Bank. And I want to sort of bring in this concept that we haven't talked about before in terms of education financing. I mean, how much do you think that should be focusing on alleviating some of the constraints when it comes to education supply and education demand?
Thank you for that question. Indeed, I mean, we have great concerns about the impact that the pandemic and the economic crisis that is resulting from the pandemic is going to have on education investment around the globe, but especially in the poorest countries that need the most support. And so we are working, the global education community is trying to mobilize attention for prioritizing education both in government budgets, but also in the big donors like the multilateral institutions and the big philanthropists. And it's a challenge because, of course, a lot of the attention is going to the health sector, to developing the vaccine and treatments for the virus to contain the virus. And then secondly, to reviving the economies of countries, investing in the private sector. So a big concern is how can we, as a community, as a global community, really raise attention of policymakers that, not reducing investments in education and actually even not increasing them because we need more resources. We need, as everybody has been saying, to focus on those most in need who have less resources, both at home and even in their schools. We know in most countries, there's a high correlation between poverty and the quality of schooling. And so it becomes even more imperative for the communities across the globe to really prioritize education. Just today we heard the news that one of the vaccines that the private sector is producing has been approved by the UK government. It's likely that they're going to be fast-tracked also in other countries around the world. And here in the United States, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, released the priority list for vaccinations. And I was struck that teachers are not among the first. I understand that health workers have to be prioritized, but I believe strongly that, just as important as it is to keep our health workers healthy, it is to keep our teachers healthy so they can be at schools and be in person and help our students learn and, have the safety and the kind of care that they require, and also to allow, parents to go back to work. So I think as a community, we have to both invest more and better in education, for sure.
Most definitely, I would agree, especially in terms of parents going back to work. All right, Andreas, let me turn back to you. When it comes to financing and the education ecosystem, if you could sort of talk to us about how big of a role that plays in terms of finding a solution, because Emiliana was talking about sort of the very apparent correlation between poverty and the quality of education.
Yeah, obviously money matters a lot, but and particularly in disadvantage. I think there's no question about it. At the very same time, I would also be cautious to see the solution simply in doing more of the same, and to just think, just adding more time and more money will lead to the kind of improvements that we are seeing. If you look at the last, beyond COVID, if you look at the last 10, 15 years, we have actually significantly raised spending on education and more or less see very similar outcomes. The question really is not to conserve what we're doing, but to transform it. And I do think we have to find ways to use resources differently. And it starts with equity. We need to become a lot better to attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms and to get the best school leaders for the toughest schools. I think we can learn a lot from countries in Asia, China, Korea. They're doing very well on that. But most importantly, I think we need to raise productivity in education. And that is about, reconfiguring the space, the time, the people, the technologies. We have a very industrial culture in schooling. We teach everybody with the same kind of big machine. We need to better understand how different learners learn differently and then embrace it. If you look at I think one of the things the pandemic has done, it has just shown the power of new technologies. If you think, while you study mathematics on a computer, that computer can now study you and figure out, what you're good at and where you are not so great, and what you find interesting and what you find boring, where you advance and where you get stuck. If you look at learning analytics, teachers can now get a sense how different students learn differently. So yes, I think the financing part is very important, particularly in the developing world. But if I look at countries, in the OECD area where I work, I think the issue really is that it's the productivity question. Education is an incredibly conservative social enterprise. And I tell you, we as parents are often part of the problem, not part of the solution. We get very anxious when our children no longer learn what was very important for us many years ago. And even more so when they start to learn what we no longer understand. If you look at teachers, they often teach how they were taught, not how they were taught to teach. And as a minister of education, you can lose an election over education when something small goes wrong. You're never going to win an election over education because it just takes time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. And that's why we haven't seen change in education. It's not primarily a question of money. It's really about aligning resources with needs. If you come from a wealthy family, schooling is not going to make a big difference in your life. If you come from a poor family, you have only one card to play, and that is a great teacher and a great school. So that's where the resources need to go.
Actually, I'd like to, I was hoping I could bring in Professor Sheeran because this is, right up his alley. But I believe that we're sort of in the middle of sort of reestablishing our connection with him. So Professor Yin, let me turn to you. I mean, one of the themes that you have been sort of underlining throughout this evening's session is technology and digital divide. Andreas talked about sort of, it all starts with equity. So my question to you is what kind of education reform would work best to protect students, vulnerable students who are, at the center of all this?
Yes. I think the directions for school, for schooling, that quite depend on the central platform, the centrally established learning ecosystem. It means that where the poor student have the opportunity to use the good platform, individualize the platform, can meet the need, and then they learn. This is very important. The question to us is that whether the government use the, create a critical mass in terms of expertise, and also have the money to implement the technology network, organize the human resources together, become the ecosystem, such that the student can learn by themselves, like use of online learning during the pandemic period, and then they can move in a pace very similar to other students, even though they are rich. It means that the lesson to us is that school-based initiative, school-based effort is important. Depend on teacher, parents, and also principal. But on the other hand, using the central platform, with the AI, the artificial intelligence, knowledge intensive, and then the student and teacher can use the resources quite conveniently, quite straightforward. No need to develop by themselves. They just use the resources from the platform. But individual school, they cannot develop the platform by themselves. The government have to do it. And even the regional collaboration, to do it. Even use a global collaboration to create such kind of central platform, such that even though you are very poor student can learn in the same situation like the rich student. With this kind of setup, we have the opportunity to tackle the issue of equity. Otherwise, no way. Because the rich student, those in advantaged situation, they take the better opportunity. The poor student, they have the poor opportunity. But with the central platform concept, organized by the government or by the regional country together, such that we can support poor students, no matter, such that they have the individualized resources, package, and learning pace, and learning curriculum. I think that the very important lesson to us in the 1990s, the people believe school-based approach is wonderful, but I would like to tell you that not sufficient to overcome the learning difficulties, except we have the critical mass. How we can build up the critical mass? We should have the central platform, use the high tech, use the technology, such that we can use the AI, to help to identify the learning problem, or what is the effective way to do it, to learn it. Just this is the concept behind. Yes.
Okay. Professor Sachuk-Shiden, I think that we have you back 100% now. Listening to what Professor Yin was saying, and Andreas made a really interesting point which stuck with me in terms of, if you come from a wealthy family, the level of your education could have marginal difference. But if you come from a poor background, it makes all the difference in the world. So, and then Professor Yin was talking about, the need for fundamental change and inequality. I mean, what, in your opinion, is needed in terms of education reform that would not only protect, but also elevate the most vulnerable of students?
Quite substantial evidence that we know what needs to be done. Now, number one, you have to invest in early childhood education as early as age 2 or 3. That's the best rate of return for any kind of investment in education. We know, especially for low-income families, especially for those kids who have limited resources at home. By the time they come to school at age 6, or depending on the country where you live, age 6, 7, or maybe 5.5, most of brain development, about 90% of our brain, the hardware, develops in the first 4 years. If you grow up in an environment, with limited resources, that could also include, nourishment as well, as well as intellectual environment that makes certain kids ready, prepare certain kids ready for school by the time they get to age 6, and other kids not ready for learning. Very commonly cited research are here in the US, which is very old now, but it's been replicated in different forms, is talks about 30 million word gap, for example. We know that by the time kids from low-resourced families come to school, they are not ready to learn, not because they are not motivated enough, not because they don't value education. And on the contrary, they are motivated, they value education, their parents are involved in schools, but their kids are limited in terms of vocabulary to express themselves, also to understand teachers' instruction. In most ways, that gap that is set in early childhood is really only get worse over the years. And every summer comes, we have this. The school calendar makes no sense. It was designed 200 years ago. Why do we have 2-3 months gaps during the summer to learning? As we know, learning is continuous. It makes no sense. But we have summers and any kind of break that is really putting all these vulnerable children who are already disadvantaged at first grade or kindergarten, put them at a higher risk to lose learning, whatever they are learning in school. So if you look at kids from these two big backgrounds throughout the school year, in September, the gap between these two groups when at the beginning of the school calendar year is widest. And then over the year, throughout the second semester, by the time you get to May, it actually shrinks a bit. In other words, schools are doing their part to a degree. It will never cancel the home advantage, but at least it does what we expect from schools as a place for social mobility. But then we have summer, another 2 months, and then if you accumulate it for 10, 12 years, depending on the school system, then you have 1.5 year gap there as well. So unless you address these two issues, early childhood education and summers, the gap will be there, and COVID-19 made it worse.
Okay, Kathleen, I want to turn to you. So, Professor Shidden was talking about, the importance of early childhood and some of the disadvantages faced by certain groups. And this is a topic that you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion. So, how do you move people into or move them into a skills-based education? Your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I used to work in the K-12 reform ecosystem, and I actually left it about 8 or 9 years ago to work in the next phase, sort of what happens when someone is 15, 16, 17 and moving into the world of work. Partly because I really felt, and maybe COVID changes this, that the point that I think Andreas made, that the numbers don't show us that throwing more money at the problems are working, and the intractability of whether it's the institutions have made, I think, the kind of transformation that we're describing in K-12 or for early childhood and middle childhood very difficult. However, the reason I came into the higher education space is because 8 or 9 years ago, because of technology and colleges were being disrupted, going directly to higher learners from high school, and colleges were feeling there was a fear factor where colleges were feeling like we're going to go out of business unless we start to innovate. And so you've seen that innovation curve and a lot of private investment coming in. It's a hot, the ed tech space has been very hot internationally. And so you see AI is playing a big role. More innovation is possible in higher education. And I think what COVID has helped us recognize is that this skills-based ecosystem holds a lot of promise for the very populations that we're talking about. The idea that in the future you could be hired for things you can do and things you can demonstrate you can do, rather than where you went to school or whether you could afford to go to a 4-year college. Obviously, there'll always be some fields that require licensure, but the idea that you can break down skills to the point that they can be unlocked from degrees, which could be expensive and inflexible and not really an option for many people. How do you make the skills acquisition attainable for people? And the kinds of programs that we started before COVID, but now we're really taking off in this country, in the U.S., are what we're calling micro pathways. It's the idea that you could earn micro credentials in a short time frame that help you build the skills from the skill profile you have, that help hospitality or let's say retail job, because many of those jobs are not coming back after COVID, and I think that's happening around the world. How do we help people make the jump to other careers? And we're working with the Federal Reserve banks here in the U.S., which have created a similarity score for skills, where you can look at a retail job and say, what are the overlap skills, and how do I make that jump from retail to something that's that uses the retail skills, of interpersonal skills and sales and those kinds of things. And it's really catching on here among both policymakers and cities and economic development organizations and employers and colleges who are saying, okay, we need to unlock our degrees and turn them into competencies that can be earned. One term being used here is credential as you go. And high schools, so in other words, the secondary schools are picking up on this too, and they're asking, and they want to be connected into this skills-based hiring and learning economy. So I could go on about it. I don't want to take all the time, but you can tell I'm excited about it, and that is because it's the first sort of construct really that holds the promise where learners become empowered to have the visibility of where targeted skills can take them. It's a strength-based frame because it starts with what can I do? What can I already do that I could demonstrate rather than having to go to a college and I may not even graduate. I can't afford it. So those are the reasons that those of us who are kind of working with what we call new majority learners are excited about the skills-based ecosystem that's starting to emerge, and COVID has helped to give it a push.
Emiliana, if I could sort of ask you to pick up where Kathleen sort of left off, because a lot of the things that she mentioned overlap with some of your expertise as well.
Yes, as I was thinking, a lot of what we are all collectively talking about in education after COVID and building.
Emiliana,
can you hear me? Oh,
Emiliana.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think we're having an issue with the sound. I mean, so let me just ask our technical operations to actually maybe sort of reestablish the connection or check the audio levels, and then I'll bring you back. But let me turn to you, Andreas. I mean, Kathleen was talking about younger children and the children that are, and the disadvantaged situations that they faced. And up until now, generally, we've been sort of talking about sort of these broad brush solutions. I'm wondering if you could sort of elaborate if this is possible in terms of making student profile specific recommendations for improvement.
Well, I think Kathleen has pointed us to this solution. I think we need to move away from this kind of very monopolistic structures that we have, particularly in higher education. A university is very good in bundling, content, delivery, and accreditation, and then selling you a very expensive degree. I think I do agree with Kathleen that the future lies in micro-credential, that we are recognizing what people can actually do right now, irrespective of where they have learned it. People may learn great things at the workplace. People may learn great things in private life. And I think we need to become better to recognize what people know and can actually do, rather than the kind of specific pathway they have gone through. So if micro-credentialing really takes off, and I think together with blockchain technology, there's a real chance for that to happen, to break that monopoly of the big institutions. I think if those credentials take off, you're going to have a lot more discretion for people to decide, what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, where they learn. You give real ownership to learners, and I think that will make it so much more possible. Think about, all the people in the informal economy. I think Turkey is a great example. You have lots of highly skilled people that are actually doing a great job every day, but they're not recognized for their skills. They're not paid for that because nobody knows what they can be doing. So I actually think particularly people in the informal economy will greatly benefit. It's just shedding a light on this. And I think this is an amazing perspective for the future. This is what technology will allow. It's going to be empowering the learner and disempowering the providers, the institutions.
That's a good point. All right, let me just, since you made a point on Turkey, let me turn to the Turkish participant, Professor Selçuk Şirin. I know that you specialize in early childhood and youth development, but you have spent time in this country. So picking up where Andreas left off in terms of empowering the learner, what specific models do you see here and in other developing countries?
Well, Turkey actually have an open university that was one of the best in the world, other than the one in London. It's been very successful in training teachers over the years. More than 1 million teachers got their training through this open university. And most recently, Minister of Education, sometimes centralized organizational structure helps in crisis. It was the case in Turkey. And as you know, can you hear me? Do I still have a problem with connection?
Yeah. No, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So Minister of Education started their own TV channel, public TV, available everywhere. And within a very short period of time, they created content in every class or every level, in every category you can imagine, multiple versions. I actually lectured there in Turkish. I loved it. The professionalism of TRT, I think, where we are doing this forum was behind that effort as well. It's been very successful. It's also unique, I think, in the developing world, where they made this available in a such short time. Within weeks, they had the TV running. All courses were simultaneously put online as well, so every child can access their database and follow classes. Teachers can communicate with students. In terms of infrastructure, I think Turkey could be a model. Now, there are other problems, of course, like internet availability. We don't have the infrastructure for a lot of children, students in Turkey to access some of this advanced materials available. But I also want to say something about higher education, because it's an area that, obviously where I work, and I'm worried for the future of higher education for the same reasons that are shared here. Because I think, there will be a role for research at higher education, high-end research, and I think we will have some of the universities in the future doing the effective work of creating knowledge. We will train, advanced researchers, scholars in different fields. Those are constant. I think what will change is some of the other elements of higher education, like skills development or vocational school as higher education. I think that will be gone. And in one of the analyses here at Stern School of Business at NYU shows, about a quarter of universities in the United States will go out of business in the next decade or two. So this is an immediate challenge. We are not talking about some distant future. We are talking about tomorrow, or if not today. And I think we have to be ready for that. And for that same reason, I want to just underline one more time the importance of early childhood education. If we were starting from scratch and designing education, not knowing anything at all from the current system, I would start education at age 2 or 3 and end it at age 18. We are talking about institutionalized central educational system. I think after that point, you can have internship, you can have on the job training, you can have all kinds of credentials, all the ideas shared before me. But the idea that we spend the first most critical years without providing education until age 6 makes no sense with what we know about brain development right now.
Satchuk, thank you very much. Emilian, I want to bring you back in because I do apologize to you. I had to sort of cut you off because we were experiencing a slight problem with our connection. So I'm going to give the floor back to you and sort of maybe pick up what Kathleen was saying, but also incorporate some of maybe the regional, your regional experiences that you have in Latin America and as well as in the Caribbean, with Satchuk giving an example from Turkey.
Well, thank you. I hope I don't have the robotic voice anymore. Yes,
Emiliana, can you hear me?
So, yes, can you hear me? No? Oh, shoot. Let's see. Let's see if with the headset, maybe again.
Emiliana, can you hear me?
Can you hear me better now? Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, loud and clear, loud and clear. This is sort of difficult to sort of coordinate. We're in this virtual studio. We have 5 guests from all around the world, and sometimes we do suffer from some of these technological gaps, and no pun intended in terms of what we've been talking about too. Let me give the floor to you in terms of some of the comments that you want to make, because I had to sort of cut you off twice.
Yeah, so I wanted to say that we can learn a lot from, I totally agree with the previous speakers about how to rethink the way we do schooling and start much earlier, but also make it much more learner driven, let's say, recognizing that a lot of the learning takes place not just in school, but out of school. And really, our models of schooling were thought through as, very industrial, that all kids would enter with the similar level of skills, would learn at the same pace, the same material. And prior to COVID, that already was failing almost all children in the world, all students. But now it's really, we're in a crossroads where we have the technology, we have the AI, we have the resources to really dramatically change the experience, so that we cater to where the student is, we understand better where they are when they come in the door, and we let them progress at their own pace, and follow kind of their own pace trajectory, knowing what we want everybody as a collective to have as foundational skills, and then continue learning throughout the lives. So I think from my experience, and a little bit related to the conversation about resources, the challenge is really that a lot of particularly low-income countries and low and middle-income countries don't yet have the resources to do this, and high-income countries will be able to leapfrog quicker. And so how do we as a global community really ensure that we don't continue to grow gaps between low-income and high-income countries, for example, or low-income and high-income students and children and youth within countries? And I think that's the core of the work that we do at places like Brookings and in general in development, is thinking about how can we help leapfrog and really do things differently, use resources more effectively, but also recognize that the availability of resources in low-income settings is much lower. And so we need to push for prioritization for those settings.
Okay, Kathleen, let me turn to you. I mean, some of the themes that we've been discussing in this evening's session, technology, the digital divide, resources, lack thereof, as well as sort of the economic divide, and what you've been talking about in terms of the skill-based economy and skill-based education. I'm wondering if I can sort of get your thoughts on what you think public information programs can play in all this.
Well, yes, I started my career in the field that you're in as a TV broadcaster. So I think a lot about the public square. The problem right now is like the sort of the word that I just meant to you and others around. What does it look like to be in a steady state, or in the people are things they can do, they have their skills in their backpack because of blockchain, and they to test out a new field, and what it takes to get to that. So they have perfect information. Employers can discover them by typing in a search saying, I'm looking for somebody with collaboration and these specific data-based skills. And they can find people all over the world who have those skills. So it's a very empowering from it solves to some extent the issue of low networked people who don't have social networks. But I think the problem is that there's probably 200 people in the world right now who have this vision in their head. How do you convince employers? It's got to start with employers, right? Because they have to create the demand. And so we need a huge public campaign around helping employers see the benefit for them of a skills-based economy, right? Is it retention? Is it diversity? Is it fit? Is it just higher reasons why they should care a lot to get from where they are today to being able to really put it into practice? How do colleges and institutions and learning providers, how do they make the shift? There's a lot of work to be done to unlock your history major or your current training program to make it competency based with the assessments required, and to make all these, to create the digital badging that goes with that. That's what the institutions have to do, and then learners have to understand the value of making themselves visible and knowing how to do it. So those three stakeholders all require huge public, a public campaign to get them to understand it, to test it, and to care, and to feel like it's going to be useful. That's a huge amount of work, but that's the kind of work that we're doing right now, at least in the U.S.
Okay. Professor Yin, if I could turn to you. Kathleen was, one of the things that she said that, learners need to make themselves visible. How do you take some of the discussion points that we've been talking about tonight, deploy them into schools once this pandemic is over, so learners can make themselves more visible?
Yes, I think the concept of learning, that will be changing. Previously we focus on the site-bounded learning. You see that, but now we brought in the concept with using the technology. Such that the learning opportunity quite different from the traditional way. You see that. Now, for example, to prepare our young people to adapt to the fast-changing and challenging situation, in the post-pandemic world, But how they can adapt to the situation easily, they need that kind of innovation, creativity, and multiple thinking. In addition to the basic skill they have, the basic knowledge they have. On top of this, that they need to have this kind of creativity. But how they can groom the creativity, I think it depends on whether they have the multiple thinking. Whether they can develop multiple thinking, in different area, such that they can adapt to the situation from different point of view. You see that. Now, creativity often defined as jump out of the box. If the student do not have the several boxes, they can't jump out to other box to make creative, to make innovation. You see that. I think that it's important. We have the facilities, we have the platform, we have the technology. In addition, we need to have a new paradigm of learning, emphasizing on the contextualized multiple intelligence, not psychological intelligence, but also contextualized multiple intelligence, such that they have the ability to jump from one box to other box. You see that, to make creativity and also to make innovation. I think the skill-based learning is important at the basic level. Beyond that, we need to encourage our young people to develop the multiple perspective and have the multiple thinking ability, such that they can jump out of the box and make innovation, to make creativity possible in the future life, in the future challenge.
Okay. I'm going to sort of move into sort of wrapping up this discussion because we're sort of running out of time. But Andreas, let me turn to you. So we've identified problems, we've quantified them, and we've sort of maybe suggested some solutions. But I'm wondering if you think that this pandemic has perhaps maybe fast-tracked inevitable changes that are needed in education, and also sort of what Kathleen has been saying in terms of how we work in the future too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we have seen probably maybe less reform, but certainly more change in education over the last 6 months. We have seen incredible amounts, and not just technological innovation, but also social innovation in education. If you as a teacher in the past used to broadcast knowledge to all students in the same way, In this crisis, you were out of business. You had to become a good coach, a good mentor, a good facilitator, a good evaluator, a creative designer of innovative learning environments. So I think it's done a lot with teachers, and teachers have faced a very steep learning curve, but grown a lot in this experience. I think students as well. Students have, been more on their own. They had to sort of be a lot more resourceful, understand how to learn. The inequalities are all real, but I do think this crisis has accelerated change. And I think there's going to be a lot of young people who are going to go back to their teachers and said, hey, I've learned to learn on my own. I found it actually very interesting to find new resources on the internet. Why do we have to go back to boring classrooms? And I think you're going to see a lot of teachers who are going to back to their school leaders and say, look, I've actually now done my own kind of lesson projects, and I've connected with my colleagues. I have actually learned to work within a profession and to create the education system rather than just to transmit it. Why do we have to go back to regular schooling? I think that momentum will stick with us. Let me just make one more point, and I think that's Professor Sirin made this as well. The early years are not just about a greater equity, creating a level playing field. I think that's a very, very important part. But I think the other part is that many of the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that are going to be so central in the 21st century are best learned in the early years. If you think about curiosity, if you think about empathy, if you think about leadership, if you think about courage, for us as adults, they are personality traits. They're very hard to change, very hard to improve. But for young children, they are skills like mathematics. In a way, schooling was the education of the 20th century. The early years, the early childhood education, that is the education of the 21st century. So I think we have to leverage that change. The crisis has shown us that the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, they are disappearing from our economies, from our societies. And the robots, artificial intelligence are taking all of this over. We have done very well in education to educate second-class robots, but now it's time to think about what it means to be a first-class human. And I do think that's what this crisis has, accelerated.
All right. Fantastic stuff, Andreas. Thank you very much. Emiliana, I want to give you the closing comments. We talked about the shifting momentum. What are your closing comments?
Thank you. I hope that, and we have realized that it's the opportunity, as we say. I loved how Andreas said it, that we've had more change, although not intentionally, not designed by policymakers. I hope we keep what has been some really useful innovations. For example, the way we have leveraged technology, the way that teachers have been forced to embrace technology and enhance it. I just recently published a report on how to realize the potential of education technology to improve learning for all, that really explains what are, based on the evidence, the comparative advantages of technology to complement the work of teachers. But also, I think we need to, I think the crisis has revealed the crucial role that schools as institutions play in our societies, providing a place where kids thrive or can thrive when well done, and where their parents and guardians can work and be engaged in their own productive activities and know that their children are well taken care of, and also a source of employment. And so really seeing the sector as a driver for the whole development of a community and a nation, I think is one of, I hope, the silver linings of COVID, and one that I hope we will exponentiate moving forward.
Right. With that, I have to say that I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our discussion. Thank you to all of our guests: Andreas Slasher, Professor Yin-Cheong Chang, Emiliana Vegas, Professor Selçuk Şirin, and Kathleen Delaski. And thank you to all of you who have tuned into this session, and this year's TRT World Forum. Over the past 2 days, we've been looking at how our world is changing and how the dynamics are shifting as we start to transition into a post-pandemic world. I hope you found it as interesting and informative as I did. The open sessions of the forum comes to an end here, but we do have a couple more roundtable discussions that will be going on later on this evening, so be sure to catch that. And before we sign off, on behalf of all my colleagues at TRT World, I'd like to extend my thanks to Mr. Ibrahim Eren, Director General and Chairman of TRT, and Ms. Pınar Kandemir, the forum's director, for again putting on a spectacular event. And last but not least, our friends in the Vision Department. I know it's been a different year, a different forum, one unique with its challenges, but once again, you stepped up to the plate and you delivered. Thank you to you all, and hope to see you next year.